Welcome back to American University's Political Theory Institute annual conference on the morality and future of capitalism. We are the Political Theory Institute, not the Economic Theory Institute, but this is fitting, of course, because economic theory is necessarily political. Even advocates of an unfettered market system conduct their advocacy in a political context for the question of how much or how little, or simply how the state should intervene in economic matters is a political decision. The mission of PTI, to treat the nexus of political theory with contemporary issues, requires that we ask what the great theorists of capitalist economics would have to say of contemporary policymakers. Wait, actually, no, sorry. Let me interrupt myself and make an announcement. I completely forgot. There are upcoming events. There's a Janus Forum debate on Tuesday, April 16th from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. in Mary Graydon 4 and 5. Is gay marriage good for America? Topical, I would say. On Thursday, the following week, April 25th, John Christian Larson from UC Riverside is going to give a talk on whether or not there is a human right to sexual satisfaction. Make up your own joke. We're going to discuss that issue. We're going to discuss it and discuss it. We're going to discuss it exhaustively until there is, well, nothing more to discuss. There's an essay contest. Political Theory Institute is having its annual essay contest for the best student essay on classical liberalism. The winner will be awarded a prize of $500. You can extract that surplus value and use it as you wish. Submit 5 hard copies of your essay by Friday, April 19th. So get to work. It's due on Friday, the 19th. Also, PTI has a Facebook page, so please like us, because we'd really like it, because we wouldn't feel cool if you didn't like us. So please go on Facebook and like us. All right. Back to the current panel. The theme of this panel is relevance, not something anyone would accuse me of. And since the policy context for us is capitalist America, the theorist most relevant for us, not by any means the only theorists relevant for us to discuss, but the theorists who are most relevant to any kind of policy discussion are capitalist theorists, theorists of capitalist economics. If you want to know why capitalism should be abolished, read Marx. Come to my class in 2 weeks. If you want to know how capitalism can be made to work for America, who do you read? John Maynard Keynes, Friedrich Hayek, and granddaddy of them both, Adam Smith. To help us understand what these complex and interesting thinkers would have to say to contemporary policymakers, we have with us 3 complex and interesting panelists. We have Richard Boyd, who is Associate Professor of Government at Georgetown University. He's the author of The Uncivil Society, The Perils of Pluralism and the Making of Modern Liberalism. He's currently working on 2 projects, one dealing with the question of liberalism and boundaries, and another with the moral foundations of the financial crisis of 2007. A paper from the latter project, Subprime Virtues, The Moral Dimensions of American Mortgage and Housing Policy, with Richard Avermenko, has just appeared in the most recent issue of Perspectives on Politics. Bradley Bateman currently serves as Provost and Executive Vice President at Denison University in Ohio. In July, Bateman will become the 10th president of Randolph College in Lynchburg, Virginia. That's right. Offer your congratulations and your condolences. Bateman is the editor of Keynes, Uncertain Revolution, 1996, and co-editor of Keynes and Philosophy, Essays on the Origin of Keynes's Thought, and the Cambridge Companion to Keynes. He is a former president of the History of Economic Society. He serves on the editorial boards of the Journal of the History of Economic Thought, History of Political Economy, and History of Economics, Thought, and Policy. Peter Boettke is a university professor of economics and philosophy at George Mason University, the BB&T professor for the study of capitalism, and the director of the F.A. Hayek program for advanced study in philosophy, politics, and economics at the Mercatus Center at GMU. His most recent book is Living Economics. He has had many impressive appointments and awards and is the series editor of the New Thinking in Political Economy book series with Edward Elgar Publishing. He is the co-editor of the Cambridge series in Economics, Cognition, and Society with Cambridge University Press, and was editor of the Review of Austrian Economics. So please join me in welcoming our speakers. And we'll go with, who should go first?
Adam Smith.
Adam Smith, that's right. Adam Smith was first. So we'll go with Adam Smith. Richard Boyd. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Borden, for the very generous introduction. I want to thank Alan Levine for including me in this program. I also want to apologize. I was included on somewhat short notice, so necessarily this might be a little less organized than I would like, but I hope you'll bear with me, and I hope to say a few things at least about Smith that'll be provocative. Alan told me it was okay to depart from the textbook Smith and maybe be a bit more provocative in pushing Smith in some other directions that'll be unfamiliar, so I took him up on that invitation. Let me start, though, with the textbook Smith, the Smith who I think is rightly regarded as being one of the founding fathers of classical liberalism and of capitalism. And I just want to highlight some aspects of Smith that I think are obviously relevant to a free society and to capitalism. First and foremost, that will be Smith's advocacy of limited government, broadly understood. And I guess by limited government, I mean limited government in the sense that Smith understood it, a government that's limited to issues of national security, issues of maintaining justice, by which Smith meant not social justice, but a sense of impartiality and equity in enforcing contracts and property rights. And also, and importantly for Smith, the idea that government should be responsible for providing certain public goods, but only those public goods that wouldn't in themselves be provided by the free market. So I think that this is an important aspect of Smith's arguments, and I think it's an important legacy that we should consider today. It can tell us something about what a good society would look like. In the sense not just of his view of the state, but also of his view of economics, we associate Smith with spontaneous order. That is, the idea that individuals pursuing their own self-interest will lead to and generate unintended consequences, which produce positive externalities for society as a whole. And this idea of an invisible hand is something that's closely associated with Smith, and I think it leads to a very optimistic view of the processes of the market. And then lastly, and interestingly for Smith, there is a suspicion of what he called men of system. That is, those kinds of planners, or the people in centralized state government who would attempt to essentially order all of society with, as Smith says, the ease with which one moves pieces around on a chessboard. And all of these features, both in terms of economics and in terms of politics, I think contribute appropriately to to our sense of Smith as being one of the most original and influential defenders of modern capitalism. All that being said, and I guess without necessarily disagreeing with the textbook Smith, as I'll call it here, I won't call it Cliff Notes Smith, textbook Smith, I want to offer a few comments about aspects of Smith's argument that I think help to problematize the textbook Smith. That is, point to aspects of Smith's argument, both political and economic, that have been neglected, and yet I think in many ways reflect upon the present condition, particularly the predicament that we find ourselves in the United States in the wake of the financial crisis. So I want to, in the following talk, draw attention to two aspects of Smith's argument, or two interpretations of Smith. One is political, and it has to do with Smith's view of the relationship between the state on the one hand and actors in market society on the other hand. And then the second is, I would characterize as being conceptual. That is, it has to do with the kind of methodological economics that I think arises from Smith. And in both of these views, and I meant this at the beginning, I'm being somewhat provocative. This is admittedly a revisionist reading of Smith, but I hope to at least point to passages in Smith that offer some evidence and some justification for the particular spin that I'm putting on Smith's writings today. So I want to start off with a passage in Smith, and I start off with this passage because I think it's important on the one hand, but I also start off with it because I've always found it to be puzzling in Smith. It was one of those phrases in Smith that sounds like it makes sense, but when one starts to think about it and push back, it begins to look more problematic and more ambiguous. And that is, in The Wealth of Nations, Smith's praise for what he calls the system of natural liberty. And if I could just read a brief sentence from The Wealth of Nations. This is Book 4, Chapter 9. And this is in the context, by the way, of protectionism and tariffs and the argument Smith is making about how the policies of mercantilism have basically shifted and allocated capital from certain areas where it would be best spent and best allocated to other areas where this allocation might not be desirable. He says there, all systems either of preference or of restraint, therefore, being thus completely taken away in a world where the system of natural liberty obtained, the obvious and simple system of natural liberty establishes itself of its own accord. So I just want to sort of play around a bit textually with this passage, the system of natural liberty. There's really two ways of reading it, two ways of emphasizing it. One would be to push weight on the system of natural liberty. And that would be the view or in the interpretation that would suggest that all that's required to obtain this system of natural liberty is for the state to get out of the way. Right, for the state to remove those preferences whereby it gives special privilege to certain industries and remove those restraints, right, that prevent actors from entering into the marketplace or from new competitors from forming. And so in this view, right, a system of natural liberty is something that would spring up spontaneously merely by the removal of certain state policies, right? Get rid of the preferences and restraints and voila, as if by a kind of invisible hand, you have a system of natural liberty. I think that's the most obvious and most intuitive way of reading this passage. But I want to suggest that there's a different sense that might be connoted here by Smith, and that is to emphasize not a system of natural liberty as a system of natural liberty. And by emphasizing system, I think if you buy my interpretation here, this draws attention to this system of natural liberty as being a system that is something that presupposes a certain framework, a certain set of institutional arrangements, maybe even certain rules of the game or certain policies that establish a level playing field. And it's only under those kinds of affirmative conditions that you get this system of natural liberty taking shape. The analogy that I guess I have in mind here is with Hayek's constitution of liberty, right? The notion that in order for a meaningful system or a society based on freedom to exist, that liberty or freedom has to be constituted in some way by the state, by the rule of law, by a system of property rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in keeping with that, and this emphasis on what it would take for us to move and shift away from a world where we have distortions based on preferences and restraints to a world where the system of natural liberty obtains, I just want to point out a few things about Smith's historical context, and then maybe try to suggest that his world is not as far removed from our own as we might imagine. You probably know this. I mean, this is, I guess, sort of Smith 101, but Smith is operating in a world which is in which the prevailing system is a system of mercantilism. Right? So there are tariffs in place to protect certain industries that England is deemed to be of systematic importance. There are all kinds of special charters and grants given to certain industries or certain corporations or certain monopolies. We're dealing with a guild system in many instances, or something that Smith much lamented, that controls the movement of capital and controls the entry of people into certain professions in ways that Smith thought were profoundly unnatural. So on the surface, this kind of long-lost world of mercantilism and tariffs and protectionism and guilds seems like it's an awful remove from the 21st century America. But I would suggest in many ways that the world that we operate in today is the same kind of mixed system that Smith himself is dealing with. Right? There is on the surface markets and on the surface capitalism, but beneath that there are systems of protectionism, systems of preferences. There are, I guess in the contemporary context, subsidies to certain industries, certain loans that are given given to particular industries or particular areas or particular businesses that are deemed to be, the winners or the corporations of the future. Certain special exemptions given to some corporations but not others. Maybe even at the margins and in extremis bailouts, right? Entire industries are given special terms, are rescued from bankruptcy by the largesse of the state. And then on the other side, I guess those are all preferences. On the other side, in terms of restraints, there are various regulatory restraints that are put into place to prevent people from entering into new industries, that raise challenges for certain corporations and competing with others. So I guess what I'm trying to suggest is that the world that we confront today is only superficially different from Smith's world. It's a mixed world, and I guess the term that I would use that captures this interpermeation of economics and politics is crony capitalism, right? That the state protects certain industries, if only implicitly. So I guess the upshot of this is that Smith's problem is in many ways our problem. And if we have a problem, then it's worthwhile looking to Smith in search of potential solutions. And I guess in a political sense, then the question is how to move away from this world of crony capitalism, or this world of mercantilism governed by preferences and restraints, to what Smith idealizes as a system of natural liberty. Well, one easy solution, and it's a solution that I would associate with many people in the free market community who consider themselves to be legatees of Smith, is to shrink the state. And this is a very obvious and very intuitive way of dealing with the problem of preferences and restraints. You simply get rid of the state, right? If you assume that the state is in many ways the source of the problem and the source of the distortions. There's something very, very strong to be said on behalf of this, right? In a world where the state is large and controls many resources, there are obvious incentives for different firms in the market and different groups in society to appeal to the state, right? It's the very largesse of the state which creates the incentives for rent seeking. And so, again, the most obvious way of dealing with that is to simply shrink the state, to move from a model of a large state to a much more restrained ideal of a small state. And I don't want to say that Smith is not in favor of or wouldn't support this as being part of the solution. But I also want to draw attention to another variable or another issue that I think Smith raises that's relevant to this question of crony capitalism, or the interpermeation of a market on the one hand and a state on the other hand. And that's the issue not of strong states, not of large states versus small states, but of strong states versus weak states. And here I think Smith's lesson is counterintuitive, but important and well worth considering. So if the issue is having a state that's in a position to say no when various actors in the marketplace come forward and ask for things, right? There's a whole army of such folks over on K Street whose job it is to approach the state and to appeal to the state on behalf of special privileges, of special exemptions. I guess our wonderfully concise tax code, which comes in at a glorious 14,000 pages or so, is testament to exactly this kind of problem and dynamic. In this view, right, if you buy the argument that the problem is of a state that is sufficiently powerful to say no to various actors in society, then this seems to presuppose a strong state. Or if not a big and powerful and muscular state, at least a state that is sufficiently insulated from the influences of society that it can afford to say no, right? It can afford to be impartial. It can afford to remove those preferences, or at least refuse further preferences in the future. And so I think this is an element of Smith's argument that has been neglected and yet I think is of very, very serious importance, maybe even grave importance today. That's the weak claim about this passage and about this argument in Smith that I'd want to set forth. That is that rather than thinking about large state versus small state in terms of what percentage of our GDP is absorbed by the state, we would do better to consider what the structural relationship is, right? Is the state sufficiently insulated, sufficiently strong to say no? But I think in Smith's terms, the argument is even more provocative than that. That is, it may not simply be a matter of the state saying no and withholding preferences or restraints, but it may actually require some active intervention of the state into the marketplace to break up and otherwise discourage the kind of collusion and the kind of concentrations of power that one finds in the market. And I just give you one example of this. Smith was quite preoccupied with the issue of merchants. And on the one hand, he, like David Hume and others, were in favor of merchants, or that the great Orpheus monopolist, right, who brings goods from one part of the world to another, and I don't want to say that Smith was averse to this, but he also had some very biting things to say about merchants, right, that he said, the mere occasion of getting together for dinner is sufficient to encourage merchants to collude with one another about how they can best cooperate to raise prices on the one hand and to drive down the cost of labor on the other. He points out that, of course, workers behave in exactly the same way, that in the discussion he gives of market price versus natural price in The Wealth of Nations, there's extensive discussion of all the different ways in which employers, he calls them masters, but what he really means are employers, can collude to drive down the price of labor, and people in the market, workers, can try to gather together and collude, right, form unions or other organizations to try to artificially drive up the price of their labor. And Smith, he condemns, I guess, both of these, but he also recognizes and acknowledges that the masters have an advantage in this system. Their smaller numbers means it's easier for them to collude. The benefits to them are more concentrated if they're successful in driving up prices of their goods and driving down the prices of labor. And then he also recognizes just the brute asymmetry of power that's involved here. So moving beyond this very specific example he gives of merchants to a society like our own, we do recognize that there are concentrated benefits that come from special preferences given by government, and the costs are dispersed upon all taxpayers. And so there's a kind of natural dynamic that encourages groups to form special interests and to lobby and to try to win out, not through true economic competition, but through benefits that they're given by the government. So I guess the solution then for Smith is not merely for the state to say no, but in many instances, perhaps for the state to, as he envisioned in his own time, to actively intervene in the market to try to use its power and its force to create a level playing field, right, to generate a true system of natural liberty. And I wouldn't want to push this argument too far, but I think there's a kind of neglected affinity in Adam Smith for many European theorists, particularly a group of theorists in France known as the physiocrats, who saw, given the world that they were living in, right, not an ideal world, but given the world that they were living in, where they dealt with monopolies and special interests and guilds and corporations and other privileged groups, that it might, in a paradoxical way, require a strong state as a means to transition into a world or a system of natural liberty. So I just throw this out here as yet another dimension, and I think a very relevant and important dimension of Smith's political economy. So the second point, and I want to make sure I get this all in, so I hope I'm not speaking too quickly. Smith's insights not into political economy per se, but into economics as a discipline and into some of the methodological assumptions of economics. Now, people commonly associate Smith with neoclassical economics, that is, with the view of economics as driven by this idea of homo economicus, of perfect rationality, of actors in the marketplace rationally pursuing their own interests and desires, and the outcome of that process being something that matches in some recognizable form an idea of perfect competition. So I think there are reasons to connect Smith with this view, but I think there are also ways of connecting Smith with some of the more emergent trends in economics as a profession, particularly behavioral economics, which is premised on the idea that human beings in the marketplace are not perfectly rational and are not given perfect information, but are in many ways deeply and perversely irrational. I give one example of this from Smith, and that has to do with the ability of human beings to properly assess and discount risk. Smith's view of human beings is that human beings are a disaster when it comes to evaluating risk. They, in Smith's view, systematically overestimate the likelihood of desirable outcomes. In his case, lotteries is the example that he gives of this. Right? Why do people buy lottery tickets? Because they have this irrational view that sometimes if the jackpot gets large enough, maybe their chances of winning will be improved. On the other side of it, they have a tendency to discount undesirable events. So just to quote briefly, the chance of gain is by every man more or less overvalued, and the chance of loss is by most men undervalued. As Smith says, contempt of risk and presumption of, this leads to, for Smith, a conspicuous contempt of risk and the presumptuous hope of success. So this is not true just for Smith of individual actors making decisions about how to allocate their own resources, but it's also for him a systemic issue. And one of the more interesting passages and timely passages in Smith is in Book 2, Chapter 2, where he deals with the issue of banks. In particular, people being willing, rather than to accept currency, right, species currency or government-issued currency, people are willing to simply accept privately issued banknotes banknotes in exchange for payment of their debts. And Smith says, you know, it might seem on the surface that there's no reason based on a system of natural liberty to reject people. If people are willing to take paper issued by banks or to buy securities and other things, derivatives that are issued by banks, that's fine, right? That's what a free society is all about, respecting the choices of actors in the marketplace. But Smith makes a very interesting turn here in response to this problem of banks issuing paper that might prove to be worthless and therefore generating systemic risk. Such regulations, Smith notes, may no doubt be considered as in some respect a violation of natural liberty, but those violations of natural liberty of a few individuals, which might endanger the security of the whole society, are and ought to be restrained by the laws of all governments, of the most free as well as the most despotical. He goes on to talk about insurance companies and why insurance is in and of itself an inherently hazardous project. I guess the folks who are working at AIG Financial Products would have done well to hearken to this part of Smith's argument about the difficulties of pricing risk and the systemic tendency to underestimate the chances of black swan events and other kinds of things. I throw this out there again just to help to qualify and to help to complexify our view of Smith and the kind of economics, right, the kind of economic insights he offers to the world. So just to conclude all this, to wrap this all up, because I know I'm out of time, I think it is fair and appropriate to regard Smith as being one of the harbingers of capitalism, right? Somebody who's a very, very steadfast and important defender of liberty and of a free society. Somebody who, in his own view, anticipates Hayek's theory of local knowledge. He says every individual, it is evident, can, in his local situation, judge much better than any statesman or lawgiver can do for him. So there's a certain deference and respect to the judgments of individuals as being preferable to the judgments of governments and states. But I think it's important to recognize for Smith that he is not a kind of Panglossian optimist, that whatever the market delivers is going to be something which is by definition something that's desirable. And at the end of the day, his defense of individual freedom and of individuals making choices in the market is not based on the idea that they think that individuals are likely to always get things perfectly right, but rather the much more remedial view that on the whole individuals are likely to be less catastrophically wrong than government. I think that's a much more skeptical, much more chastened view of things. Anyway, with that, I will conclude. Thank you.
I'm trying to see if I can make the stopwatch work here, but I'll do my best. That's a hard act to follow, but I have to tell you I'm really happy I get to speak before Pete Boettke. I don't know how many of you students will know who the great rock and roll artist Jerry Lee Lewis was, or is. I'm actually not sure whether Jerry Lee Lewis is still alive, but Jerry Lee Lewis was called a killer because no one would perform after him on stage, and that's how you ought to look at Pete Boettke. Nobody wants to perform after him. So I've known Pete for a long time. I don't know Richard. That was a fabulous talk, and I really thank you. I really want to thank the Political Theory Institute and Alan Levine for inviting me. It's really great to be here. I think that this is a wonderful institution, and I think it's a wonderful day to be able to think together about capitalism. The person that I'm asked to speak about today, John Maynard Keynes, is a British economist who was born in 1883. That means that when he was 20 years old and he went up to Cambridge University, it was just the end of the Victorian age. It was the end of Queen Victoria's 63 years of ruling Britain, and he came just at the moment of the beginning of the Edwardian era. What's much more important than who was on the throne is that this meant that Keynes would spend his adult life in a period when capitalism felt like it was in crisis. And from he often characterized in his own work the period before the First World War as having been a very stable period for capitalism, but he characterized this as a stability based on self-deception. And what happened after the First World War, and for the rest of his life, he died in 1946, was for him largely a world in which capitalism was in crisis. And what I mean by that is that of course, following the First World War, the continental European economy, there was massive inflation and destruction across the continent in the interwar period, economic destruction. And in Britain, between the years 1923 and 1939, there was only 1 year when unemployment was below 10%. So for the British, the 20s were a period of deep crisis, and the crisis didn't start after the stock market crashed in 1929. They'd already been in crisis for many years. And at the same time, there was in the world at this time, of course, the rise of the Soviet Union and the Bolshevik Revolution. And so it was a time when the world seemed different and there were different potentialities. For Keynes himself, one of the important moments of his life that I think would matter to students of political theory is that the Liberal Party was collapsing in Britain. It had its last great electoral victories in the first 2 decades of the century, and the Labour Party was taking over from the Liberal Party. And I've argued in much of my work, as have other people, Keynes was very clearly a liberal. And his life's work was, to the degree that it addressed questions of political theory, was very much about trying to find a form of liberalism that he felt was sustainable. The thing that I want to talk about today, however, is much more narrow than that. I will say, I point out to those of you who are young political theorists, the philosopher Thomas Baldwin, a British philosopher, has pointed out that perhaps one of the greatest lacunas in British political theory is that Keynes never addressed John Stuart Mill. He dealt with the same questions in his own writing. That is, what is the role of the state? What are the rights of the individual? But because of a particular quirk in Keynes' life, that when he was an undergraduate, he apprenticed and studied under a moral philosopher at Cambridge named G.E. Moore. Moore was completely dismissive of utilitarianism and unfairly, frankly, dismissive of Mill. And so Keynes never did engage Mill's ideas. And that is a loss in the history of political theory, I think, because they were dealing with many of the same issues, particularly around this edge of where the state and a market economy fit with each other, and how that fit between the market and the state can sustain individual liberty. This was very, very central to Keynes' life. And for those of you who are young, you'd understand this, I think, most clearly because Keynes was in his life serially bisexual. From his adolescence through about age 40, he was a homosexual man performing homosexual acts in a society in which that was a felony. He would have been put in prison had he been revealed. After the age of 40, he married a beautiful ballerina, and as far as we know, never engaged in homosexual acts again. He very much cared about sexual liberty and wrote about it during his own lifetime, although at the time this was far in the far left of celestial space, I would say. The story that I want to tell you about Keynes today is a story that you wouldn't know, and it's a different story than most people think of when they think of Keynes. So the first thing I want to do is to tell you about his attitude about capitalism, and then I want to switch from that, his moral judgment of capitalism, to his policy recommendations about how to make capitalism work better. I'm going to try to tie those two things together and then get off the stage. To put it very bluntly, Keynes felt that capitalism was morally objectionable to the extent that it was based on a love of money. He felt that love of money was not a healthy impulse in humans. I'm going to go on and explain that in a little more detail in a minute. And to the extent that capitalism was based on a love of money, he could not approve of it. However, he argued that capitalism was acceptable, and in fact not only acceptable, but that it was the only acceptable system we had because it was so much more efficient than any other system, particularly socialism or communism, which he felt were not productive enough to offer a decent standard of living to people. So he was caught in a bind, and this is a kind of argument about capitalism that you don't hear very often today. Today, the arguments about capitalism tend to be collapsed into either it's no good because it's selfish and awful, or it's only good, everything about it's wonderful, so it's all or nothing. So this kind of middle ground where there's something objectionable about it but it is the preferable system is somewhat unusual in a more nuanced position than you would normally have today. Now, to understand Keynes, to fully understand his attitude about the love of money, you'd have to understand his interest in Freudian thought, which I don't have time to go into. Freud had ideas about money and unhealthy attitudes about money, and Keynes and the circle that he moved in were very interested in those ideas. But to be more specific, what I want to do is to say that Keynes was not a utilitarian. This he got from G.E. Moore. He didn't deny that some people try to maximize utility, but he didn't believe that it was always the best or the good thing to do, and he didn't think that it's always what people did. So he thought that it was neither completely descriptive nor appropriately prescriptive. And so this makes him completely different than virtually any economist who you know or you've studied with, who are at their heart and core utilitarian. They assume that people try to maximize their utility. That's the primary motive, so strong that you can net out other things and focus on that in a very narrow way. And secondly, that's a good thing, and so you can measure the welfare of people and you can measure policies by how much more it gives people. And you can roughly approximate dollars for utility. So the more that's produced, the better off people are, the better the policy. That's where we argue against economists. I'm an economist by training. We argue against rent controls. We argue against fixing the prices of milk and so on. We can show you very simply why these lead to suboptimal outcomes. So Keynes was not a utilitarian. The system that I would argue he put in its place is one that he got from a close friend, Roger Fry, who was an art critic, who characterized and who had trained as an evolutionary biologist, who argued that there is an actual life and an imaginative life. And in the actual life, we take care of housing ourselves, feeding ourselves, clothing ourselves. And in the imaginative life, we pursue science, we write poetry, we do political theory, and this he saw to be of a higher value. These were the higher human values. So you had to take care of the basic things in life, but you should aspire to these higher things. Interestingly, Fry was deeply influenced by the American economist Thorstein Veblen, and Keynes, like Veblen, argued that the thing that stood in the way of achieving the imaginative life was the emulative tendency. This is that our desire to have what other people have, to emulate other people. He said if you could get past that, if you could get past your desire to have what the Joneses have or to be better than the Smiths, that you could then more easily attain to poetry or science or political theory, to religious life, whatever it is that you engages your imaginative life. But as long as you're stuck with the emulative tendency, as long as you're unable to get past it, you're stuck trying to get more stuff. You'll get wound up into that world, and it'll be harder for you to escape. Hence you can see why he saw the love of money as so destructive. It was kept you from achieving the imaginative life, among other things. As I said, you'd also have to understand his Freudian background and other things, I think, to fully understand his suspicion of love of money. Nonetheless, I'm telling you, while he didn't like the love of money, and he saw this as a great fault of capitalism, he felt that capitalism was the best system that we could have. It was the best one we knew of, and I would argue he saw it as his moral responsibility to try to make capitalism work better. So that was a moral responsibility. Make capitalism work better. Now, to understand then what he wanted to do, to switch from the moral arguments about capitalism to policy arguments, I need to tell you what's wrong with capitalism. That is, why doesn't it function well enough? What could be done to make it function better? And here I'm told no graphs, no equations, and so I'm going to try to do this narratively for you. In a nutshell, Keynes believed that these are two sides of one coin. The two fundamental problems with capitalism were, number one, that private investment fluctuated regularly, up and down. And second, that it had a tendency when it fluctuated down to get stuck on the downside. He saw the greatest evil of capitalism as mass unemployment. This is the thing that he felt was most destructive to capitalism because he believed in capitalism as a system, because he was a supporter of capitalism. He wanted it to function well enough that it could be sustained, and he felt that mass unemployment was a threat to capitalism. If you have 50% unemployment among people under age 30, if you have 35% unemployment in society, it's very hard for capitalism to carry the moral authority or the moral legitimacy to be able to continue. And you'll see the rise of fascist parties, socialist parties, communist parties. And so as a liberal, his belief was he had a responsibility to make it function better. So the question then comes, if the problem is that private investment fluctuates up and down, capitalists get excited, they invest a lot, the economy lifts, so you think about the internet boom, it gets up and then it goes back down. What causes that to happen? And he argued that was expectations. These are businessmen's expectations. So he says entrepreneurs and business managers have to make decisions. Their optimism gets up. He says this is not a mathematical calculation, so fortunately I don't need a blackboard. It's not a mathematical calculation. It is a intergroup attitude. So people all read the Financial Times, they all read the Wall Street Journal, they all watch MSNBC, they get the same ideas, they get optimistic about the future, they think things are going to be okay, or vice versa. They hear bad news. So today's headlines in the Financial Times said stock markets, today's headlines as I was sitting in the audience this morning, stock market keeps going down, down, down because this morning bad unemployment numbers were released, or bad employment numbers, I should say. The additional new jobs last month were only half of what was expected, and so businessmen, investors think, oh, things aren't doing as well as we think, maybe the economy's not going to lift out, and their sort of herd instinct drives them down. He believed that that those expectations could be driven down and get so bad that you couldn't get back up again, and that's how he described the Great Depression. That's what he said was happening. Now, the world that so his argument would have been, his argument to us would be, the problem with capitalism is that it doesn't generate enough employment regularly. His goal would have been, he didn't believe that you could get rid of the business cycle, that is those swings in private investment, but he did believe that you could minimize them and that you could keep the big collapse from happening. So you could get capitalism on a better upward trajectory. So the oscillations were smaller and they didn't ever go way down and get stuck like that. That was his dream for capitalism. He believed capitalism would have more moral authority, more moral legitimacy if that could be achieved. And that was his goal. I want to say parenthetically, and I'm very near the end now, Keynes is not a particular driver himself of the welfare state. His concern was employment. It was not redistribution. The redistribution project in Britain was driven by William Beveridge, someone who had been the director of LSE and who had been an antagonist of Keynes through the 20s and 30s. Beveridge wrote a terrible review of Keynes' great book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, and it's only late in their life that they had any kind of reconciliation. And Keynes' part in working with Beveridge, at first Keynes was angry at Beveridge, that Beveridge used his ideas about full employment in his blueprint for the welfare state. Then he got over that, and his biggest role was cutting back what Beveridge wanted to give in the welfare state, to make it more financially feasible. So the Buchanan and Wagner argument about Keynes wanted a large state, he wanted huge deficits, there's no textual evidence for any of that. I just have to tell you, Keynes never argued for a large state, he never argued for a large welfare state, he was not a redistributionist by nature, he was an elitist, frankly. And so, although he was not opposed to the welfare state, his primary concern with it was whittling it back so that it was not too expensive. Not at all the picture that's been painted of him as a politically naive man who didn't understand politics and had ruined Western capitalism with his ideas. Now, painted that way by some. So I want to finish by telling you, what did he actually suggest? What would he have said we could do about capitalism? And this is much less aggressive than what you would see. If you're young and you've heard the name Keynes, you might think that Keynes has a salt and pepper beard and writes for the New York Times twice a week, and that he's changed his name to Krugman. What Krugman argues is not at all what Keynes argued, I would argue. Keynes did believe in public works projects. He did not believe in running large and continued deficits. I would allow, faced with the collapse of tax revenues, Keynes would not argue for austerity. If the economy collapsed and tax revenues collapsed, he did argue in his life it's not a good idea to then also cut government expenditure because of that collapse in tax revenues. He said that will only lead to more unemployment and more political instability. There's your lesson for today. Europe, austerity, yes, no. But he argued explicitly through the 40s in his work that he did not believe in deficits as traditionally described. So what did he think he was doing? Well, beginning early in the 20s, he argued for separating the capital budget out of the regular budget of the government. This is what businesses do. And he said, on the capital account, you should run up public works projects. This is building roads, building new post office, building new airports, fixing bridges. You should do those things when the economy gets weak. And you should have all those projects, they should be open and transparent. The projects you want to do should all be sitting on a shelf, and the National Investment Board should say, we're going to sell bonds, which will, by the way, the income generated from the projects will generate the tax revenue to pay the bonds off. And he believed that those wide swings in private investment could be minimized, and you could prevent that downside collapse if you could get confidence that those public work projects would be rolled out when they were needed, and that we would pull back on them when they weren't needed, when the economy was booming. It's not a strong, definitive statement about how to save capitalism. It's a hope about how to manipulate capitalist expectations. It's a much more modest proposal than Keynesians themselves often propose, and it was never meant as an argument for a large and growing state to control capitalism in some way. His whole project was to try to corral investor expectations to keep private investment at a higher average level, and so to sustain capitalism's legitimacy by preventing widespread unemployment. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a great opportunity, and I wish I could be here with you guys all day long. I'm running a conference myself over at George Mason today, and so I'm running in and out. But what a great sort of thing to be part of, and the speakers that are here, they're very good, so I hope everyone's taking advantage of that. Both Richard and Bradley's talks invite the idea of trying to respond to them rather than give my own talk, because they raise a lot of really great issues. From Richard's talk, you get the idea of thinking about pushing in directions that are uncomfortable for these thinkers. So imagine that Adam Smith has a scab on him. What you want to do is you want to scratch the scab off so that you can sort of examine it and see whether or not it heals or whether or not it actually festers and causes a problem. You know, when it thinks about Hayek in this regard, so when I think about Hayek in this regard, and you think about the tension in Hayek, there is a classic tension in Hayek, which is that our moral intuitions are at odds with our moral demands. Our moral intuitions emerged out of our small group. Yeah. What's going on? Yeah, we'll get there. Yeah, okay. Thank you. Our moral intuitions, because our evolutionary past is out of small group and intimate orders, or think about small groups made up of homogeneous actors, and that's where our moral intuitions come from, they're at odds with the moral demands of the Great Society, which requires us to interact with large groups of heterogeneous agents that are far different from our homogeneous group. And in order to realize the great benefits of modernity, we have to take advantage of the division of labor, and therefore we should have evolved a moral system that attributes, moral weight to the behavior that's associated with anonymous interactions. And instead, our moral intuitions are in fact derived from this more intimate order. And so the question is how do you sort of negotiate that tension in Hayek? And that becomes a very big part of his project. I'll get to that in a second. With regard to Brad, it's important to keep in mind the historical context with which he put you in, which is Great Britain from the early 1920s all the way through the 30s only experienced 1 year below double-digit unemployment. This is a period of a long stagnation and a variety of various policy experiments that have been thrown at it like spaghetti on a wall. And Hayek and Keynes are in the midst of this debate starting in 1930. And it is the case that they were the main rivals. For those of you who have a history of thought bent, you don't have to go on YouTube and watch the rap videos, okay? You can read a real reputable source, which is Sir John Hicks. And he wrote an essay called The Hayek Story. Sir John Hicks is a Nobel Prize winner himself in economics. And he describes this period of time in the 1930s when we didn't know who was right or who was wrong, Keynes or Hayek, and it was an ongoing battle about those different positions. Brad himself is one of the great historians of contextualizing Keynes and the Keynesian revolution, and I really recommend to you a book that he published in 2011 that's published by Harvard on Keynes, the Capitalist Revolutionary, which is co-written with Roger Backhouse, and it's a very, very powerful book that addresses the kind of issues that Brad was talking about here. But the fact that Keynes and Hayek are these two major adversaries, Hayek sees himself as a modern Smithian, so this is kind of an interesting dialogue here. And Smith, of course, has that same tension in the difference in the impartial spectator between our span of our moral sympathy, which also Hume has as well, span of our moral sympathy. I care more about the splinter in my dog's foot than I do about the babies dying in China, right? Our span of our moral sympathy is limited. That's the same thing that I was just talking about with our intimate order versus our extended order kind of idea. We want to have that extended order rather than just the intimate order. So I would also, what I want to do as I think about this, so there's just another reference that's very relevant to what Brad was talking about. There's a great article written many years ago called Keynesian Splenetics. We economists, so Krugman understands Keynes as a technician would understand Keynes, as a dentist would understand Keynes. There's a set of tools for social control. Keynes gave us some insight into those. They were codified in the existing literature of economics, and Krugman's a modern practitioner of that crude sort of what got called Keynesianism. But Keynes himself is a product of an earlier age of thinkers. He wasn't trained as a technician in economics. Neither was Hayek, neither was Smith. They're moral philosophers trapped in an age of economic scientism. Okay, Hayek's just the youngest of them, so he lasted a lot longer. Keynes's PhD is actually in philosophy, as Brad pointed out, and a brilliant book on probability theory. I mean, he was a big-time philosopher. His father was a great economist, and so he was part of the economics community in Cambridge from early on, but he was a great philosopher. And he hated, now I'm going to deviate from Brad somewhat maybe. Maybe I'm overstating my language. But I think Keynes hated Victorian society. He was part of the Bloomsbury group, which wanted to reject all of that Victorian morality and all that kind of stuff like that. If you want to know what that is, think about Jane Austen, and what's Mr. Dashwood or whatever. You're deep in love with someone, but you'd never call them their first name kind of thing. That's Victorian England. And he was very, very disappointed about what was going on in the great stagnation with regard to capitalism. And he's trying to figure out a way to sort of fix this. And this is what Brad and Roger talk about in their idea that Keynes is this capitalist revolutionary. And so, but think about this, what is Keynes reacting against? There's a broader issue involved. And this debate that was going on in the 1930s and into the 1940s was such a harsh debate going back and forth and carried out not just, again, the economics profession was just at the beginning of its institutionalization. So Keynes controlled one journal, the Economic Journal. Hayek controlled another journal, Economica. They actually were fighting, but they also fought in the middle of the newspapers in the Times of London and things like that. And positions came to be embodied as a saver versus a spender, even though both sides of the position probably were more nuanced than what politics forced them into more extreme signs. And you see those debates come up again. Just to capture the spirit of this age, I think, and for you guys thinking about this today, read a book like G.L.S. Shackles, The Years of High Theory, which is about what was going on in economics. It was really, really cool to be an economist at a time when the economy really, really stunk. Right? Everyone wanted to talk about economics. Everyone was debating it. What does it mean? And this is where Keynes and Hayek are at the center of it. And if you think about it, since 2008, that's also the world that we've lived in. Right? We've lived in a world where it's like cool to ask these kind of questions and have conferences like this and debating these kind of issues. So I want to encourage you in that dialogue and to think about that and wonder if in retrospect we'll ever come back and think about the years of high theory as being the years in the 2010s or whatever. I have some doubts about that because I think that the institutions of professional economics have become more solidified and therefore more resistant to the kind of conversation that took place in the 1930s. So when Keynes says he had to work really, really hard to overturn the habits of thought within the economics profession, I wonder whether or not our habits of thought today are harder to overturn than then. I don't have an answer for that. For those of you who think about economics seriously, I would like you to contemplate that. Okay. Hayek was not a neoclassical economist as that has come to be understood. He is a neoclassical economist in the sense that he believes in choice on the margin and choice against a given constraints, and in the role that prices play in guiding resources and competition in pushing those resources in directions which will tend towards the prices equal their costs. But he doesn't believe in perfect agents interacting in perfect market structures. All right, so his model of man and his model of the market are as wildly opposite of the standard assumptions in an intermediate price theory book as you could find from some of the greatest critics. Here's actually an ironic twist of fate. Joan Robinson, a close colleague of John Maynard Keynes and the inventor of the concept of imperfect competition, is actually more of a neoclassical economist than Hayek is in the model that she works within. Hayek is working from a totally different set of assumptions about the way the economy operates. Which makes him appear, as Richard pointed out about Adam Smith, appear as a behaviorist to some, though I think that just is a strange understanding of humans. The fact that people are fallible but capable doesn't mean that you have all kinds of anomalies running all over the place. So the reason why you get behavioral economics is because you have a very weird view of Homo economicus, who makes no mistakes. So that's a model. Institutions matter. Well, that's no big deal. We live in a world of institutions, right? Well, it's a big deal when economics argued that our goal was to strive to have an institutionally antiseptic theory, an explicit goal of 1950s style price theory, institutionally antiseptic theory. All right? And equilibrium tendencies are different than perfect equilibrium dovetailing of the states. All right? And so Hayek is working in kind of a different framework. So this is all this stuff. I don't have time to do this, right? And it's also, to do it well, you know, it would be, yeah, I can't do this, but I'm going to suggest this last one, which is, I mean, these are actually very, Hayek, the one thing I will say is the following. Hayek started his career, remember what I said, as a technical economist. It was picking up this puzzle from Wieser, which is how is it that a car, right, the value of a car, which didn't exist at his time, is the value of a horse and buggy, right, would then somehow be equated back to the way that I would have the price for horses that I would buy or the hay that I would feed the horse with. Okay? That's an imputation problem. From the value of the final good, I derive the value of the higher order good that goes to produce it. Now, why am I bringing you up with that? Everyone looks a little bored right now. What's the definition of socialism? Right? It's collective ownership of the means of production, not collective ownership over consumer goods. That wasn't what socialism was about. It was collective ownership over the means of production, which are what? These higher order goods, these remote goods that go to service what? The consumer goods that are down there. In fact, as we'll see in a short bit, the model of market socialism was built on the premise that you could have a market for consumer goods, but not have a market for producer goods, and there wouldn't be a problem, okay? So Hayek, from early on in his career, was focused on this. Hayek's teacher, in a, not a technical sense, but in a loose sense, is Ludwig von Mises. And it's quite fascinating to see Hayek and Mises because they have intertwined careers but separate fates. The reality is that Mises is who Robbins and Beveridge wanted to come to the LSE. But Mises didn't have a good command of English language, and he actually was kind of a curmudgeon, so he didn't like to travel. So who did he send? His, like, little buddy. Like, they invite him, and he says, yeah, that's okay, but little buddy will go. And so I'm going to send Hayek over there. Hayek was already writing in English. He spoke, I mean, he wasn't exactly, you know, eloquent spokesman in English, but his writings were in English. He could speak English, and he went to LSE in 1931, gave this big lecture. Everyone fell in love with him, and then he got the big professorship at the LSE. Mises didn't really care. Like, I mean, it wasn't like Mises was like, oh my God, I gave it to the little buddy, and the little buddy outdid me, because Mises was quite happy living in Vienna. One of the big things that when Mises taught at NYU, people always wonder, why didn't he move from NYU? Well, if you talk to anyone who knows him, the reason he didn't move anywhere from NYU is because of Mrs. Mises. Mises lived in a portion of New York City after World War II called Little Vienna. Where else would you go where there's all kinds of people that you used to live with in Vienna, but now you live in New York City? So Mises didn't want to live anyplace else. In fact, he was offered a job at UCLA, and he referred to Los Angeles as barbaric. Why would I want to go there? I'm in New York, right? Princeton, no, I ain't going to go there, right? Columbia, he would have taken a job if they would have given it to him, but they weren't offering. And he also had an offer from Rochester, didn't want to go there because that was barbaric as well, cold and whatnot. But Mrs. Mises, she really liked, you know, Little Vienna. But what Hayek gets from Mises is all of his problems. So as a research program, you have a problem generator, and then you have a problem solver. And Mises is a problem generator, and Hayek is his problem solver. And he solves those problems, and that relates to methodology of economics, business cycle theory, problems of socialism, and different economic systems. Now, I'm going to run out of time before I get here, so I want to sort of focus on why it is that Hayek becomes a classical liberal. Here's the interpretive puzzle. In 1931, Hayek comes to the London School of Economics, gives his talk, which leads to the book Prices and Production. Everyone at the LSE becomes a Hayekian. Him and Robbins going to transform the curriculum at the LSE to be the upstart to Oxbridge. Right? It's a great story. The underdog LSE taking on the Oxbridge establishment in, round, 15, going to knock it down, right? The underdogs are doing it. And what are they? They're all young and dynamic and major guys. Robbins is not a slouch, right? He can punch with anyone. Hayek is going to punch with anyone. They take over this journal, which is the counter thing. Their students are bright. Their students go on. LSE, by the way, is a fascinating place. Just 2 years ago, they had their first Nobel Prize winner in residence win the Nobel Prize, Pissarrodis. It's the 10th one that was either educated at LSE or taught at LSE that won the Nobel Prize in economics. They just didn't stay there. They went other places. Ronald Coase being one of them, and as I said, Sir John Hicks and all these ones. So here's the puzzle. Hayek in 1931 and 33 gets all these students whooped up into a frenzy to believe that sound economics will generate in you an appreciation of the market and a concern with you of trying to intervene and plan the economy. By 1935, 36, 37, Hayek is dealing with graduate students who are writing papers using their understanding of Hayek's economics to defend intervention and planning. So, if you're a teacher, and all Jay right here, right? Jay, super teacher over here at Georgetown, or Lauren, you've been teaching in your classes, and all of a sudden people start like using your language, but to end up with opposite conclusions of what you've been arguing. And they're your closest graduate students. You have a little bit of a response. One of them is, you know, WTF, right? I mean, like, what's going on here, right? And that is Hayek's response. But notice what Hayek does. Hayek decides that the answer is in philosophy, not in economics. He's like, you must have the wrong philosophy. In fact, it's even bolder than that. It's like you must have read Saint-Simon in the Cartesian Rationalists. And he goes off on this long thing. It's called the Abuse of Reason Project. But just imagine what it would be like for an economist to now start assaulting an entire project of worldview. So what Hayek does is he embraces into this idea of this Abuse of Reason Project, and key to the Abuse of Reason Project is institutions. Economics always exists within institutions, and some institutions are conducive to learning, and other institutions are not. They prevent the learning. So, in one very strong sense, what Hayek is saying to you is that the pure logic of choice is a necessary but not sufficient condition to generate an economic outcome of coordination of plans. In order to do that, you have to have a system of institutions within which individuals engage in. Those institutions are like classroom environments. Some classrooms have white boards with black letters. Other ones would have the lights out with black, screen with black letters. How would you learn in that environment versus the other environment? Note that the information, quote, information, is up on the screen in both environments. What Hayek wants to suggest to you is that capitalism, a private property market economy, because of the incentives and the signals that it sends, is like the whiteboard with the black, ink. Whereas socialism, with collective ownership, administered prices, okay, is going to be like the black room with the black ink up there. You won't be able to learn. You won't be able to translate the technical into the economic. I have 2 minutes left, so I just want to read this quote. My wife, by the way, always makes fun of me. She says, Pete, they're PowerPoints, not power paragraphs. But I want to, just bear with me.
Actually, 2 minutes over, so.
Okay, so I just want to, because this is the point about Hayek here. Though at one time a very pure and narrow economic theorist, I was led from technical economics into all kinds of questions usually regarded as philosophical. When I look back, it seems to have all begun nearly 30 years ago with the essay on economics of knowledge. I'll let you sort of read the rest. But what this does is this is the reason why you have a technical economist who wrote a book called The Pure Theory of Capital, who then writes a book, The Road to Serfdom, The Constitution of Liberty, and Lawlessness and Liberty. Economics is about exchange and the institutions within which exchange takes place. If our styles of thought take our attention away from the uniqueness of the institutions, someone has to come back to make us think about those institutions again. So, the reason why capitalism failed in the 1930s is an institutional problem. not endemic to capitalism itself. Institutional problems require institutional solutions, and that's why the emphasis on the framework. Classical liberalism is a philosophy about the framework. Okay? It's a philosophy about what the law should be. This is liberalism, right? It's about what the law should be, what the institutional structure. And that's what Hayek's doing. I apologize for running over. I'm exiting the show and leaving the stage. Okay.
Okay, I'd like to give our panelists some time to respond to one another. Do you have disagreements about how the others framed their analysis of their respective theorists? Questions, comments, and then I want to throw it open in fairly short order to questions from the audience. So, attack each other viciously.
But with civility.
That's right. Viciously but civilly.
Uncivil society.
So I'll take Pete's. Pete took a stab at me. And in the best sense. I shouldn't have said it that way because I couldn't help but reflect in listening to Pete how, as someone said this morning, how diminished. It was the dean who noted how diminished public discourse is today, how often we don't talk at each other and how often we yell at each other. And I realize what a privilege it is to be with people with whom you can really discuss things.
Oh, yeah, right.
So Pete said, well, Brad, what do you think about, in the last chapter of Keynes' General Theory, he referred to this program that he imagined of trying to minimize the fluctuations in private investment and to keep them from ever collapsing completely. He called this the socialization of investment. Pete said, come on, fess up. There's something wrong there. So I want to say, first I want to say something provocative. I'm going to say, actually what I want to do, I want to say I think that Keynes is more of a Smithian liberal in this sense, in the sense that Richard has talked about, than he is a socialist or some kind of crazy leftist. And this is the sense in which I mean it. First of all, although it's very little known, if you've read his reading notes, Keynes loved Smith. That's a very little known fact. Number two, Keynes loved individual liberty. Number three, Keynes, like Smith, believed that people's actions and their mode of rationality was shaped by their location in society, that is, what role they played in the economy. This is very clear in Smith, and it's also very clear in Keynes. But most of all, the biggest reason is that, like Smith, Keynes believed in capitalists as the engineers of economic success. He never argued that the state was going to make economic success. He believed in the end that the best you might do was to try to boost their morale a little bit. But he still believed that capitalists were the engine that would drive economic success, as Smith did. And like Smith, he saw them as imperfect people. I think he actually didn't see them, he probably saw them as more inept than he did as evil. Smith probably saw them as a little bit more crooked than Keynes did. So I would actually say that Keynes is more like a Smithian liberal in this sense. And the phrase socialization of investment, I think there's just no way to understand that phrase than to understand Keynes as a rhetorician who was constantly trying to find ways to pull people who were attracted to the Labor Party back to some kind of modified version of liberalism. And socialization of investment sounds like something you could say on the stump that when you're being fiery and you pound the table and so we're going to socialize investment. Yeah, great, vote for me. Yeah, good. I think it's very much a rhetorical ploy on Keynes' part. I don't think it represents anything like a commitment to socialism, which he constantly said was a failed experiment in his essays. Anyway, that's my retort.
Maybe just following up on that, I didn't know much about Keynes. I guess I know an awful lot more now after this panel, and I really appreciated Brad's comments. But I'd always, subscribed to the textbook view, the thumbnail view of Keynes that's floating around out there, that he was some kind of mad collectivists. And I was struck by so many of the aspects of his argument that Brad highlighted that really do seem similar to Smith's. The focus on emulation and the degree of ambivalence about emulation. When you were talking about that, I was thinking of Smith and the passage on the diamond buckles, right? It's on the one hand, it's the pursuit of diamond buckles that leads to a kind of personal corruption, right? Conspicuous consumption on the one hand, but then the paradox is that by all of us pursuing conspicuous goods, conspicuously pursuing goods, somehow good things happen for society as a result of that, right? Where we break down to the countryside, the growth of the towns, the growth of an extended market order. So it seems like there are really some interesting similarities there that I'll have to explore further, and also a kind of similar ambivalence about capitalism, right? A commitment to capitalism, but an understanding of some of the limitations, moral and sociological.
I would say that in some sense, and I would want to flesh this out. This is just a very instantaneous response. I think both Keynes and Smith saw capitalism as the game. It was the driver, but they saw it as secondary in their own personal hierarchy of values. I mean, neither one of them, I would just say that. So I'll let that go.
Just to respond, it's not really a response, it's a clarification. I mean, one of the things that people that are thinking about these things should realize is that Keynes and Hayek actually were quite close friends, and they had a lot of mutual respect for one another. They also had a shared passion, which was antiquarian books and book collecting. Hayek wrote The Road to Serfdom because when LSE was shut down during World War II because of the bombing raids, Keynes provided him with the rooms in which he wrote The Road to Serfdom. And all reports are, most economists are very boring people. So when they were doing the Commanding Heights video, I got called in to down at actually here in DC or Arlington, Alexandria, where they have the Masonic Temple is where they took the video of it. And the reason is because when they interviewed Skidelsky, it turns out Keynes is really fascinating. And when they interviewed Bruce Caldwell, who's the leading biographer on Hayek, it turns out Hayek's a really, really boring guy. What Hayek did was, he woke up in the morning and wrote. And then, at some time in the afternoon, he walked to the LSE and had tea, and then taught his classes, and then, went back home. Keynes, on the other hand, he's, as you said, he's hanging out with the Bloomsbury Group, he's supporting the arts, he's making a ton of money in the stock market, he's, all over the place. Very, very charismatic person. If you want to get a sense of Keynes, there's a recent transcript of the Bretton Woods meetings right after World War II. And Keynes dominates. I mean, he comes in, he just, comes in, everyone is like to him, he's charismatic, he's drawn, everything like that. Hayek was sucked up into that whirlwind of Keynes as well as anyone else. And he asked Keynes, right around the Bretton Woods thing, shortly before his death, because Keynes died of a heart attack in 46, I think, or 47?
46.
Yeah, and from exhaustion or whatever. But Hayek had met him and said, hey, aren't you worried about the inflation? And Keynes said, yep, I'm worried about inflation. If it starts to tick up, I'll just say this, and everyone will do what I say. Now, so Keynes had a very, very dynamic personality. He was the center of attention wherever he went from the time he was little. As Brad can tell you, when he goes all the way back as a student, he was part of that elite society. And he viewed that appropriate British citizen, elite, would rule the economy in the interest of the economy in general. And that sets up certain institutions which then, are questioned in the post-World War II period. But it's a fascinating story to see these two of these guys. And I buy the basic story that Brad is putting out, is that Keynes is not Oscar Longa, right? Keynes is not even Abba Lerner. He is something different. He's a liberal who wants to sort of salvage what's left of liberalism in the wake of this crisis.
Okay, I'd like to throw this out to the audience. Tradition has it that we begin with questions from undergraduates, so please raise your hand. Is this not? Oh yeah. Please, we have microphones on either side, so please get up and approach the microphones with your questions. Great. Yeah. Okay, that's fine.
So I was interested in the characterization.
I'm sorry. Could you identify yourself?
Yeah, I'm Daniel Keene. I'm in the Department of Economics here, PhD student, and I was interested in the characterization of the socialization of investment as a rhetorical device by Brad, because there actually is a place where he talks about in much more detail in the end of laissez-faire, and he refers to the joint stock companies as his ideal example of the socialization of investment, and that's what he has in mind, even though he covers it more briefly in the general theory. And I think Peter's been doing a project with the end of laissez-faire, Professor Betke has, and I was wondering if you had come across that and had any thoughts on how that relates to the use of the socialization of investment in the general theory.
Well, Daniel, it's nice to meet you in person finally. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of discussions about various different forms of isms and whether or not people mean by socialism ownership or simply some kind of what you would call hybrid forms of firms. So this, by the way, this confusion comes up also in the post-communist period in Russia when they call privatization meaning firms that became municipalities combined with firms and things like that. And I guess the real question from an analytical point of view is, what are the attenuated property right structures in that kind of form that might run into the same kind of problems that we identify in the more simple models that we use when we talk about socialism and capitalism? So I do think Keynes makes a very clear argument. So I disagree with Brad on a few things. One of them is that Keynes' argument for public works. And it's because we're in an aggregate demand deficient economy that he thinks we can do this. And he does say that the state is in a position better than the private individual to decide on long-term investment strategy. And I think that those two questions raise issues. And the passage that Richard mentioned about Adam Smith, it's precisely on that point, the state deciding on how private individuals should allocate their capitals versus the private individual deciding, that the debate takes place.
So, I think maybe we should take questions. I want to respond to that, but let's take more questions.
Yes, please, Locke.
Yes, Locke White, it's the Department of Government at the SPA. I guess my question is, given what y'all were saying about capitalism and how it fluctuates up and down, and what role exactly and how big of a role should government play in trying to keep the economy at a place where it's not overly disruptive to society?
Well, we're going to have different views.
Yeah.
The point that I was trying to make, which obviously I didn't make because I took too much time doing other things, bad on me, is that capitalism's instability is an institutional issue. So if you think about the current crisis that we just went through, the question you'd have to ask is, if you deal with people where you can socialize the risk but privatize the profits, are you surprised if people engage in riskier behavior than what they should? I don't believe that's an issue of people not being able to calculate the risk or some kind of delusion about the risk. It's a systemic incentive problem caused by institutional rules. So it's a question, now, do people do stupid things? Yes. Sometimes stupid things get penalized. That's good institutions. Sometimes stupid things get rewarded. Bad institutions, yeah.
If I could maybe just echo that. This is going to sound glib, but you don't do what I fear we're doing right now, right, in the sense of rendering effectively the rate of return on money at zero, right? And because it seems, in the interest of trying to stimulate, it just seems to me that we're pushing people in the direction of further risk-taking, right? And that's an effect of the rules of the game, right? The rules of the price of money, the opportunity cost of investing in CDs versus investing in junk bonds. And you know, it would not surprise me if things ended very, very badly. And I think I'm sort of maybe backtracking on something I said earlier, that I do think there is a propensity in human beings toward risk-taking that can lead to problems. But, you know, it's very, very clear that people now are being driven into risk-taking behaviors that are just completely irrational. And that's not a reflection on human nature so much as it is, as Pete's suggesting, an artifact of policy. And just one policy, right? Monetary policy. Then we can think about the ethics of bailouts and the kind of incentives then. If you allow people to take stupid risks and then you don't make them internalize the cost of their own bad decisions. And it seems like that's the message that was sent loud and clear by the response to the financial crisis.
Brad? Okay. Yes, please.
Yeah, I want to viciously attack Pete Betke. You could hear the place rumble before when Jane Austen turned over in her grave. She was in it long before Queen Victoria took the throne in England. So don't blame Victoria, it was just these boring Georges. Second, World War II did not end in 1943. So I'd advise you to look to when Bretton Woods took place, not after World War II. But yeah, 44. So those are two vicious attacks, and you don't know how much good this has done me.
I just want to say that the Political Theory Institute has performed a tremendous service by allowing a vicious attack to be made on behalf of Jane Austen. I hope this is not the last time this happens, but it is the first, and I'm very proud. Yes?
So I have a question about Keynes, and actually not really about Keynes, but Adam Smith and Hayek with regard to something Keynes has said. So one of my favorite essays by Keynes is Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. And you know, for people who haven't read it, and I'll oversimplify it, won't do it justice, especially in front of an editor of a book on Keynes. You know, he's arguing that between the period of 1930 and 2030, we're going to see something like 8 times economic growth, and we'll be able to kind of get on with the art of living and not be so concerned with material consumption and be able to go to higher kinds of values and not be so concerned with growth. I'm just curious if you could tell me what you think Adam Smith would say in response to that essay, and then what Hayek would say in response to that essay.
Well, I'll say in its basic, I'll start in saying in your basic outline, you're right about a piece of the economic possibilities of our grandchildren, a very famous essay by Keynes, which he gave for a couple of years as a talk. You know, he went around when he would be invited to give talks, and then he published it. And on the economic side, he made a raw prediction. He said it was published in 1930, and he said 100 years from now, output will be 8 times what it is today. I mean, that was an unimaginably larger amount of material goods than existed in the 1930s. And he was making that prediction at the bottom of the Depression. He was almost exactly right, except we got there about 20 years early. And this is what I mean about his fundamental optimism about capitalism. His argument in the Economic Possibilities of Our Grandchildren is not that the government is going to take over the economy and push it to 8 times its current size. It is that the unbridled enthusiasm of capitalists is going to carry us to that place. And so this is a sense in which I see him as, at least in some sense, as Smithian, because he sees the entrepreneur and the businessman as the engine of economic growth. And he saw that well enough to understand an unimaginable amount of prosperity. I could say more, but I'll just say that in that characterization, I think you're exactly right.
But I do think that it raises an issue about his view about post-scarcity, right? And so that's where he would run into a difference with Hayek, who didn't believe methodologically we should make that argument about post-scarcity. So, I mean, I think one of the things that's very fascinating is the spread of Keynesian ideas besides just the economics of Keynes. There's a famous book called Keynesian Economics and the Economics of Keynes. I think that you could also have a kind of riff on that with the work that Brad and Roger have done as well, because why is it that Keynes was so attractive to so many different people at that particular time, especially young people? And it's not because they took his nuanced position, I would contend. It's because they took an implication of his position, which was a totally new direction to take economics, economic policy, and everything. And I think that the reason for that is that Keynes was able to, Keynesianism was able to combine our greatest fear of capitalism, which is mass unemployment, with our greatest resentment of capitalism, which is the idle rich, and then explain how the two are interconnected. And as a result, it became a framework for interpreting the society that had existed and how we could maybe transform it. And it's that twist that explains why everyone becomes a Keynesian after World War II, right? I mean, so it's a kind of a fascinating story.
It sounds like a line between Keynes and Occupy Wall Street. I mean, think about the sensibilities behind people like that. I mean, I know you're saying that there are differences, right? But the fear of unemployment, right, what is the idea, but that there are these huge distributional inequalities, and all the money's being somehow absorbed by the banksters on the one hand, leaving all the rest of us with nothing to do, and motivated by this hatred of some 1%, right? This new proverbial class or group that we have to create to demonize.
And correctly so.
The only
right? Because they get it through cronyism, right? I mean, it's the same thing.
the only comment I would make about what Pete said, in trying to create a difference, trying to understand the differences, not to create, but to understand the difference between Hayek and Keynes about the idea of there being a post-scarcity world. I mean, I really think you have to understand that part, and that's the other, I would say that's the other half of the essay, Economic Possibilities of Our Grandchildren, because Keynes says, on the one hand, we'll be 8 times richer than we are now. So he says then everyone will be able to pursue religion, poetry, science, whatever it is that is in the imaginative world. And of course, that's his dream, that's his value system, that's his moral compass, that's what people would want. And the reason that we don't have that, we do have the material world. I think he was absolutely clear-eyed about how capitalism works and its potential. And he got that part exactly right. But what he was wrong about is that people would be able to put down the emulative impulse. It still drives people, and it still is what defines economic life. Now, there are some important arguments to be had, about whether we would have the success if the emulative impulse were to go away. But just to understand Keynes' own take on the possibility of living in a world after scarcity, I think he understood that we could create enough to live without scarcity, but I think he was just wrong about how difficult it would be to give up the emulative impulse.
Okay, last question.
And on liberty, Mill dismisses the concern of the free market and free trade as concerns for individual liberty. I was just wondering how the three economists would kind of address that conceptually and theoretically.
What was the question? It was about...
It's about Mill's dismissal of free trade and the free market as concerns for individual liberty.
I may be misremembering the passage or the argument that you're thinking of, but isn't the distinction on liberty, there are things that are purely self-regarding actions, things like speech and belief and conscience and religion, and those are things that the state can never regulate. And then there's all other things that are conduct, right, which are at least in principle the kinds of things that can be regulated. But then there's a subdivision among the things that can in principle be regulated. There's certain things we should regulate and certain things we shouldn't. And I guess what the stuff about trade is that so long as, I mean, he thinks prudentially, right, it's a bad reason to. Prudentially, it's a bad thing to regulate trade. But in principle, at least, the state could do so if there were some kind of overwhelming justification for that. So I don't think that's inconsistent with the broader argument, the broader distinctions he makes on liberty.
So if you look at the principles of political economy, there's probably never been written a better sentence in defense of laissez-faire than what Mill writes, and it's followed right on its heels by the biggest exception to laissez-faire you could ever find. So it's a kind of a nuanced position. So compare that to Adam Smith. Adam Smith has one of the more damaging passages, both Brad and Richard referred to it today, which he says, businessmen seldom meet but to conspire to fix the price. Right? So, and that's not a good thing. Businessmen meeting to conspire to fix the price. But Smith's next sentence, which is right after that, is that there's nothing that's consistent with the system of natural liberty that can be done to prevent it. Compare that to Mill. Mill says, every intervention is an evil. That's a direct quote. Every intervention into the market economy is an evil. All right? Then the next line, but we have to basically let a lot of evil in when all the bad things happen in markets, right? So what's the thing that you emphasize in that? It's kind of an interesting discussion.
I have
one last thing. I mean, Richard, I should point out, Richard is an expert on one of the most troubling and interesting thinkers of the 20th century, and it would have been very cool to have him talk about that in this context of here, which is Frank Knight, which is what Richard sort of has written a lot on early in his career. Because Knight is also a very fascinating character that stands between basically Hayek and Keynes as well. And it's a very, very, whenever I read Knight, especially this book, Intelligence and Democratic Action, I have this overwhelming sense that I'm either reading the greatest genius that ever touched in economics or the most arrogant man I ever could have met. And it's an amazing sort of exhilarating experience. I recommend all of you to do that and look at that, because Knight is a very, very tension-filled thinker himself.
All right, well, I want to thank our panelists for a really stimulating discussion. I want to thank you for your questions.